Let's get straight in. So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Results UK Grassroots Conference Call for April. I hope that you're staying safe and well and that you've had a good Easter break. For those of you who don't know me, we've had a chance to meet. My name's Aaron Oxley. I'm the Executive Director here at Results UK. So welcome to you all. As many of you already know, we record these monthly calls and post the recording on our website so that the people who've missed the conference call can catch up later. Of course, we always enjoy seeing people's faces, but please feel free to turn off your video if you'd rather, just whatever works best for you. Now, this month, we're trialing the use of closed captions on the call. I don't know, I can't see them in front of me right now. Is there something anybody has to do, Naveed, to turn them on?
Something Della will need to do because I don't know how to do it. We'll work on it.
Make me co-host. I will do it now. Thanks.
Thank you.
For the reminder.
Okay, very good. So we're about to turn on closed captions, and once that's done, you'll be able to activate them. How?
They'll just show automatically for everyone.
Well, okay, they'll show automatically. Amazing. Having used them before myself, it is magical, but also not 100% accurate. So warning you in advance, it's not going to be perfect, but hopefully some people will find it useful to help following along with the discussions. We, of course, welcome everybody's feedback on this, but let's just see how it works. If we've got anyone new to Results on the call this month, a very special welcome to you. Please feel free to introduce yourself. I'll give a shout out for that in just a second. Alternatively, you don't want to actually go off mute and say hi. You can, of course, introduce yourself using the chat function. Just let us know where you are in the country. Of course, it's not compulsory to say hello, but does anybody want to for whom it's the first call, wants to say hi?
Yeah, hi, I'm Mike Swan. I'm Vikki Burns' stepfather.
Hi, Mike. Welcome.
Good to meet you. So I live down near Cambridge, and Vikki's told me on and off for a little while about Results and what you're trying to do. And yeah, I've thought it's an excellent organisation, and you know, wish you luck with all your efforts.
Well, thanks, Mike. We'll wish you luck with all your efforts as well. We'll get you into action before the end of the call, but really great to have you with us. Thanks for joining. Does anybody else want to say hello?
Hi.
Hi.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say I'm from London, and yeah, this is my first call this evening.
Hi, Jojo. Welcome. There was someone else, I think.
Hi, I'm Liam. Hi, I'm new as well. I'm based in Manchester.
Hi, Liam. Welcome. Manchester, lovely part of the country. Really glad you're with us. Anyone else? And yeah, no pressure. Why don't we jump on, get on with the call. One last bit of housekeeping before we get right into it, which is to remind you to keep yourself muted during the call. And if you've got a question or a comment, please do feel free to use the chat box. You know, go crazy there. We've got people keeping an eye on that, so that's exactly what that's there for. Don't worry, it won't be distracting to our speakers. They'll just barrel on all the same. Speaking of which, I will introduce our guest speaker in just a few minutes. But before that, we're going to have some time to hear a bit about what you've been doing around the country, and also some introductory remarks from me about how the work we do at Results to advocate for the end of global poverty is being affected by the things that are happening in the world right now. So I'll start off with that. So I want to update you about the government's planned cuts to the UK's international aid budget. There are around £5 billion per year. That's about a third, which would reduce the aid budget to around £10 billion this year. That might sound like a lot, but it's only 0.5% of our gross national income. So over the last month or more, we've been increasingly getting an idea about what this could actually mean in practice. Some of you will remember a couple of months ago, we had Ian Mitchell from the Centre for Global Development speak to us on this call. And we've been working with his figures to work out what might happen. And to be clear, we've still not heard from the government what their plans actually are. There've been no consultations at all, and we only have access to the same leaked reports that you can see in the news. So in addition to a huge cut of 60% of aid to Yemen reported a few weeks back, we're also seeing reported cuts of 30% of aid to Syria. A link to one of these reports we're just going to put in the chat box just now. We're also seeing a potential catastrophic cut to funding for polio eradication, with the possibility that the UK pledge made back in November 2019 that could be effectively abandoned, which we know that the World Health Organization is extremely concerned about, and it's something that a lot of you have worked on. And as you'll know, if you've been on some of our previous calls, the government has made no commitment at all on funding for nutrition programs. Now, because of the amount that they've already committed to multilateral programs like Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, the government will have to cut the UK's bilateral aid program. That's money that goes directly to programming in individual countries. They'll have to cut that by around about 25%. That's our guess, though, because we still don't know for sure. What that means, it would make it impossible to put money into programs that tackle malnutrition at anywhere near the level that is needed. Cuts at this scale will see, for example, fewer children under 5, women of childbearing age, or adolescent girls reached through nutrition-related interventions. Again, the source that we're using for all of this, we're going to drop that in the chat box too. So not only does this have a huge impact on these country programs, on the humanitarian programs I've already mentioned, but it even makes it impossible for the government to meaningfully take forward its own stated priorities, which include education and global health security. This level of cuts makes it really hard for the UK to credibly argue on the world stage that they are taking a lead on international development, despite all the government's rhetoric about a global Britain being an international development superpower. This simply isn't true anymore, given the scale of the reductions that we're seeing. 63% less than in 2019 to spend on strategic priorities, according to the One Campaign. This makes it particularly important for the government to rethink its position in advance of the G7 meeting of world leaders that's scheduled for the 11th to 13th of June to be hosted here in the UK in Cornwall. And that's what we're going to be hearing more about later on in this call. I know I've said it already previously, but a huge, huge thank you to everyone who's taken action on this already. The volume of letters you've been reporting have been at the highest levels ever, we think. We know of 52 contacts with MPs on aid so far and 48 letters to the Foreign Secretary on last month's action, funding for the Global Partnership for Education. We suspect at least a few of you have taken action without telling us. If so, do let us know so that we can be sure to include your contribution. I really want to remind you that the quality of letters and individual communications you are making is hundreds or perhaps thousands of times more effective than any postcard type campaign. This really is a truly unprecedented contribution to the fight against the cuts and for spending on the things that we know are so important to people and communities around the world. It's just been incredible. Now look, whether we win these arguments in the short term or not, the government cannot claim these impacts on the world's poorest people and most fragile communities are a necessary economic cost. In its integrated review, which was finally revealed on the 16th of March, we saw an articulation of a government policy that intends to increase spending on nuclear weapons at a time when it feels we can't afford to spend money on fighting disease and poverty, even during the global COVID pandemic, when there has never been a more greater need for this. Again, I'm going to put a link, well, someone will put a link to the integrated review in the chat box so you can take a look at it for yourself. What is clear is that this is a political decision, and they are deliberately choosing to go against our advice and the advice of many of their own MPs. And this is a cut which does not have to be made and will have huge impacts on the numbers of people dying unnecessarily from disease and being entrenched further in poverty by poor nutrition and a lack of access to education. Many of you have quite rightly been questioning our calls for resourcing things like education, nutrition and polio, putting more money into them on the basis that if the pot of aid money is getting so much smaller, then we can't have everything we want, so we need to prioritize. But we cannot credibly ask for less than the sums we know are needed and are affordable. In fact, we know that the need in the world is actually far greater than what we're asking for. And we always try to argue for what is achievable, or there'd be no point to our advocacy. So we need to continue to argue for what is right and leave it to the government to face the awkward consequences of its own policy and political decisions. So for at least the next couple of months, we're not accepting that the cuts are a done deal, even though we're hearing that Boris Johnson thinks he doesn't need to pass legislation to make the cuts legal. That's something that goes against the government's own legal advice, by the way, particularly This week, we're hearing that the Chancellor now wants the aid cuts to last longer than they were saying only a few weeks ago, that we would return to spending 0.7% of our national income on overseas aid when we're economically able to do so. So we can see now that there's a distinct possibility, if we didn't strongly suspect it already, that there may be no intention to not only miss the target for a year, that would put even more pressure on the government to legislate. So though we don't have a vote for a date for a vote in Parliament at this stage, we're not accepting that it's off the table with the government's own policy position in such disarray. Lastly, I can't not mention the Police and Crime Bill, which some people are concerned could have a massive impact on freedom of speech. And indeed, we at Results are very aware of its potential impact on our ability to achieve our mission, to work with people to exercise their personal and political power for change. We can't condone the violent scenes such as happened in Bristol recently, but we do think there are legitimate ways to stand up for the right to protest and to be involved in the political process. There are agencies in our sector which are leading the charge against this bill, such as Amnesty International. In fact, they've got a petition on this on the very front page of their website. That's enough for me from now. I'm actually going to hand over to Della for the usual roundup of all your activities around the UK in the last month. Over to you, Della.
Thank you, Aaron. I'll just kick off with a few campaign updates and then talk about some of the great things that you've been up to for the last month. And then I've got a couple of events just to signpost at the end. So yeah, firstly, I just wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone who has written to Dominic Raab on global education. It's been really inspiring to see some great numbers for that. I think so far we've had 48 letters sent from the network to the Foreign Secretary, which is really good. Colleen, who is on our parliamentary team at Results and Leads on Education, wanted me to say a massive thank you and say how much of a help it's been to have your support from the Grassroots Network. So yeah, our latest update on that campaign and the ask for the Global Partnership for Education is that we think junior ministers are looking at the investment case at the moment, meaning we're hoping a decision will be made soon. But there's still time to influence it. So if you haven't sent a letter yet, please do, and we'll let you know when we hear more on the campaign. So yeah, in terms of what you guys have been up to since our last call, there's been a few important international days and moments happening, which has meant a lot of activity online. On the 22nd of March, to mark World Water Day, we had blogs from the Brighton groups and Manchester group on both your WordPress pages. So I'll put links in the chat so you can have a look at those. But I thought it would be nice if someone from the Manchester group told us a little bit about how they went about writing the blog. So I think we have Cameron on the call who is going to talk us through that quickly.
Hi there, Della. Yeah, thank you.
Hey, thanks, Cameron.
Yeah, a lot of our group are away at the moment because it's holidays for uni. So yeah, I think it was kind of a thing. We wanted to do something together as a group, and that was something that came out of one of our calls that we had. And so Jess came up with the idea of doing about World Water Day, and sort of taking sort of some activities from a few different areas, but certainly from the World Water Day website, and where they were calling for people to really recognise what water meant to them. And then we had a bit of a discussion about, well, how do we link this back to SDG 6, I think it is, and kind of, yeah, and bring in sort of the wider discussion about the aid cuts and the impact they would have on sort of water and sort of safe sanitation and hygiene. And so that was a really nice kind of activity for the group to come together around and sort of action different members of the group to take on different sections, and then to edit the blog before putting it up. But definitely sort of a big shout out to London and the Brighton group for, we basically just stole their blog format, and that made it a lot easier to copy them.
Thanks, Cameron. I think it worked really well. There's some nice quotes from the group on like what water means to you, and then yeah, really good linkages with development and the SDGs, and also some nice actions that you can take as well. So yeah, really good job, and thanks for sharing. I've put a link in the chat to both those blogs so you can all have a look. So later that week, on the 24th of March, we had World TV Day as well. And I just wanted to say thanks to everyone who liked and shared all of the TB Hope campaign assets that results made on social media. We partnered with Sitan Plus, who are an organisation in Zambia and who work on health, to create these videos of advocates talking about their experience with TB and why they think it's important. So if you haven't seen those yet, I'll drop a link in the chat, and hopefully they'll be useful for you in future if you're ever talking to anyone about TB and why it's important. We also had some activity from the Edinburgh group on World TB Day, which was really exciting. So shout out to Kathy, whose idea it was to basically digitize an in-person exhibition they were going to have last year in Scottish Parliament on TB. Because of COVID, they weren't able to be there in person, so we ended up turning the exhibition into an online one. So I'll drop a link in so you can have a look at that. So yeah, I think a good example of groups thinking about how they can adapt to COVID and lockdown measures and still do meaningful campaigning. So yeah, do have a look. We also had the International Day for Ending Racial Discrimination in March, and Emily from the Edinburgh group created some really good graphics for that, which I'll also share in the chat. I thought I would hand over to Emily because she's been really busy making all these amazing graphics for loads of key moments. So it might be nice if, Emily, you want to talk us through kind of how you go about that and what your inspiration is.
Yeah, thanks, Stella. Hi, everybody. So yeah, I've been really inspired by all the international days that have been happening recently. And I think that's a really good way to try and create engagement online, because I think people really can work with that with international days. So I basically just search the international day and then see what comes up, and I look for a reputable organisation and see what they're up to. There's normally always campaigns and events and hashtags that you can use. So yeah, and then I use the web platform Adobe Spark. You might have heard of it. It's a really easy platform to use, and you can just kind of collate little bits of information in a really pretty way that makes people kind of stop and look. For me personally, I just try and keep it all really minimal, and I kind of use myself as a target audience and think what stats and what imagery would make me stop and take a look. And yeah, I always put in actions and use a hashtag and tag all the reputable organisations and Results UK, just so as it's reaching as many people as possible. And yeah, it's been good, it's been fun, and yeah, take it up and have a go if you'd like, and drop me a message if you'd like to find out more.
Thank you, Emily. I think we can all agree they always look fantastic, so thanks for always sharing those, and nice to hear from you as well. So next, I'll just move on to some upcoming events that we have. So we have a training day coming up on Saturday, the 15th of May for the Grassroots Network. We're calling it Inclusive and Creative Campaigning. So we're going to think a bit about how we can encourage inclusion in our groups and make sure that we're actively opposing different forms of oppression in our campaign networks, and also a bit more about how we can utilize various online tools to keep our campaigning fresh. So yeah, I'll put a link in the chat so you can register. It's going to be just over a half day with plenty of breaks, because we know, yeah, not everyone wants to be on Zoom on the weekend, so hopefully it will be exciting and not too full on. There's also another opportunity coming up to learn more about campaigning and advocacy in the International Conference, which is an event run by our partner organisation Results in the US. And they make a point of inviting Results volunteers and partners from all over the world. So you are very welcome to join. It's happening from the 12th to the 13th of June, and there'll be various sessions on doing advocacy, how to engage with the media, and specific ones on sort of campaigning policy areas like the Year of Action on Nutrition. So I will put a link in so you can register if you're interested. Our national conference in the UK is likely to be in early September. We don't have an exact date, but we will let you know when we do. So yeah, just bear that in mind for now. yes, I think that's everything from me. I will just make sure to drop all the links in the chat so you know what I'm talking about and can have a look in your own time. So yes, I'll hand back over to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Stella. That was, as always, one of my favourite parts of the call, hearing what you've all been up to. It's really powerful. Let's jump onto the topic of tonight's call. It's the upcoming G7 summit and what that means for the issues that Results works on. As I've mentioned, at a time where a lot of focus is rightly on the aid cuts, the UK government has this key moment in June where we will be hosting the annual meeting of the G7 world leaders. Those are the 7 richest nations which collectively have a huge amount of resources to address the world's most pressing challenges, be it through aid spending or otherwise. Now, the G7 meeting is a big opportunity to influence the policy agenda and make sure that these nations are adequately prioritising things like health systems, making sure the world's COVID-19 response is reaching the poorest countries, and not only those with the deepest pockets, and that the ongoing health challenges such as infectious disease control and nutrition are continuing to receive the attention that they deserve. So to tell us about this and the opportunity for advocates to make a difference at this international level, we're joined tonight by Results' own Clare Symonds, who is the Senior Policy Advocacy Officer for Tuberculosis and who leads for us in sector-wide conversations about the G7 and the G20. She's in a great position to tell us about why and how this international gathering matters. Now, Clare joined Results UK at the start of this year, back in January. Previously, she's held various policy roles within the charity sector and in the UK civil service. She's passionate about equity and inclusion, both within our policy, advocacy and research work, and also within Results itself. And she has a background in disability rights. So what she does for us at Results, she focuses on influencing institutions like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB and malaria, which many of you will know, civil servants and key government departments like the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and the Cabinet Office, and developing key messaging for global events like the G7 and G20 summits and the World Health Assembly happening each spring to ensure that global commitments on fighting TB are met and to ensure that all people are able to access affordable TB care and the treatment that works for them. So Clare, I see you're on the call. Really great to have you with us. Thanks for joining. I think you've been on one of these calls before, so you'll know that we have volunteer campaigners from right around the UK, from Scotland to the South Coast, some with a lot of experience of advocacy on international development issues, and at least 3 who are brand new tonight, at least new with us, probably some knowledge of international development, don't want to presume. So as usual, we'll start by asking you, Clare, a few opening questions. We've shared those with you in advance, but after that, we're going to open the floor to everybody who wants to ask a question. But before we get into that, Clare, could you maybe just introduce yourself to people on the call and share a little about your motivation for doing what you do and what it was that drew you to Results?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Aaron. And hi, everyone. Lovely to meet you all. This is my second Grassroots call. Yeah, really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you a bit today. As Aaron sort of mentioned, I'm quite new to Results, so and new to the international development sector as well, I should say. So the last few months have been a really exciting sort of learning curve for me, and an opportunity to really make some impact in an area that I've been really passionate about for a long time. I studied international development a few years ago now, and then kind of gathered a bit of policy experience in different sectors. So joining Results has been a really amazing opportunity for me to sort of apply the policy experience I've gained elsewhere, but in an area I'm really passionate about. Specifically looking at the role I'm doing on TB. It's again been a really exciting learning curve, and I think there are so many opportunities at the moment. While COVID has been obviously a terrible thing to happen across the globe, I also see a lot of opportunity in the way that we can sort of leverage the response to COVID and turn that to improve our responses to other global health issues, particularly TB. So yeah, really excited to be with you and to have a chat about everything I've learned so far on G7. And yeah, that's it from me.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks for sharing that. And we always love to hear a little bit about why people do the work they do, and not often a question you get answered by your colleagues in quite that way. So really, really good to hear from you on that. So let's go straight to our usual prearranged questions before we open up to everybody else. When we do get to those, for anybody that prefers to send in a question via SMS, maybe you're a bit far from the keyboard or whatever, the number for that is 0777 56 11178. That's 0777 56 11178. And otherwise, do put questions in the chat box as well, and we will of course unmute and yell out also. But let's go to the first of the pre-prepared questions, which I believe is coming to us from Sheffield.
Hi, Claire. Why does the G7 matter for the issues, results, campaigns about?
Hi, Rebecca, thank you. So really good question. And essentially, I mean, in very simple terms, I think the G7 matters for the issues that we campaign about, because it is the coming together of the richest economies in the world and some of the most influential organisations in the world. So as well as those 7 largest economies, a number of organisations like the UN and the World Bank and the World Health Organization attend as well. So it's a really good opportunity for sort of constructive conversation around key issues. And it also provides an opportunity for policy commitments and sometimes for financial commitments as well to tackle all manner of global challenges. I guess maybe a little bit of background might be helpful just to set the context. So as Aaron talked about a little bit before, the G7 is made up of the 7 richest economies in the world. So that's the UK, France, the US, Italy, Japan, Canada, and Germany. However, the host country is also allowed to invite observer countries to join each year as well. So this year, the UK has invited South Korea, India, and Australia to join, which makes up newly branded Democracy 10, which is a slightly controversial concept because it's clearly quite an anti-China there's something in there that is a bit controversial. So the branding is being looked at a little bit, I think, as well as obviously, like I said before, those other organisations like the World Bank and the UN. So not only does the summit act as a moment for the governments to commit spending, but it also sort of sets the policy agenda for the year ahead. So whatever is spoken about at the G7 summit and in all the sort of meetings running up to that, sets the agenda for what all of those countries and those organisations are going to be focusing on for the year to come. There are a number of sort of different strands to the G7. So a lot of the work in the run-up to the Leaders Summit, which is happening in June in Cornwall, is run by the Sherpa team. So those are sort of senior civil servants from each country who run the negotiations and attend all the meetings in the run-up to the summits. So sort of behind the scenes at Results, that's someone that we look to influence and hope to meet with as well to kind of put forward our priorities. And then alongside the Sherpa meetings, you've got different strands of ministerial meetings. So there's the finance ministers, health ministers, development and foreign affairs, and then the leaders as well. So the Prime Minister joins that one. And out of each of those sort of strands of meetings comes a communique or a declaration, which all of the ministers from each country in each of those strands will sort of decide on what this communique will say. And that is the document which sets the tone for the year ahead and commits those countries to working on specific issues. So obviously from our perspective, those issues that we want to see the G7 commit to are for financing for global health, particularly looking at multilateral organisations like the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB and Malaria, and Nutrition for Growth as well. And it's also acts as a really good opportunity for countries to sort of put the pressure on each other a little bit to spend and also to commit to focus on these areas as well. And I guess this year particularly is quite important for the UK in terms of G7 for a few different reasons. Firstly, it's the first G7 summit to take place since the COVID-19 pandemic. So the 2020 summit was due to take place in America last year, but it was cancelled. They didn't do it virtually or anything, they just decided not to do it. So the tone of this event will be very different, and it will be really important to look at how those 7 economies come together to sort of combat the pandemic and build back better is the theme of the event this year. As well as that, there's the sort of background context of the UK aid cuts, as Aaron was talking about earlier. I think that aid cuts, there's a risk of the UK sort of losing its standing in sort of global development, and this summit offers an opportunity for us to demonstrate our leadership even where cuts are being made, which is quite a challenge, I think. And finally, the UK is running the G7 this year, so there's no official sort of secretariat to the G7. It rotates every year, and this is our year to run it. This means that we set the agenda for the G7, so we decide what the key issues are. I say we, I mean the UK, not Results UK, sadly. We set the agenda for what the sort of key topics in each of those ministerial meetings will be. And it means that we get a really good opportunity to sort of set the direction of this year of work. And I guess that's why it's so important that we take this opportunity to influence the government this year more than ever, because the UK does have a sort of unique opportunity to really drive change. The commitments that are made each year do sort of renew the way that key global challenges are worked on and looked at. So by influencing the government and putting the issues that Results UK works on, like infectious disease response, nutrition, vaccinations, we increase the chance of seeing really sort of strong language in those communiques and declarations that come out of the meetings, which really sets the policy agenda for the year ahead. And particularly, obviously, in this case, we're talking about global health and health system strengthening as well. So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, very, very comprehensive answer. Without further ado, we are going to jump, and you gave us a nice segue into question 2. We're going to jump straight across to Lynn Lithgow for that one.
Hi, Claire. It's Bentley from Lynn Lithgow. Why should strengthening of health systems be a priority for the G7?
Thanks, Bentley. Yeah, again, another really good question. And I think this year, more than ever, is a real opportunity to sort of put health system strengthening on the agenda. The pandemic has shown more than ever how important it is for all of us to have strong health systems which are resilient to shocks. So health systems which are able to cope with a major event like a global pandemic, whilst also continuing existing services and making sure we don't take a sort of backward step in progress that's being made elsewhere. And I guess what we need to achieve those strong health systems is a fully funded global health infrastructure. And that's where the G7 comes in. As the 7 sort of richest economies in the world, it's massively important that the G7 nations commit to putting money into strengthening global health responses. And the G7 offers a really unique opportunity to draw attention to that need and to ensure that global progress towards sustainable health systems and towards universal health coverage is really a priority at that event. So I guess in terms of health system strengthening, what we're looking for is our systems that are able to prepare for and mitigate against the impact of future pandemics, as well as building towards stronger treatment and sort of responses to existing diseases like tuberculosis, meaning that all people everywhere are able to access the treatment that they need in order to live healthy lives. I suppose if the G7, so those 7 richest economies, put money into global health, which is what we hope to see from the summits, or particularly strong sort of policy commitments, lower income countries will be able to build health systems which work for them. So it's the sort of localized approach towards building health systems that will naturally make those health systems more resilient, so that if there are future health shocks, which undoubtedly there will be, each country has a health system which works for them and which will inherently be stronger and more resilient in the future. So the key areas for results where building stronger health systems is really important is are kind of building those. I'm sure you've all heard the language we use around the building blocks of global health. So particularly looking at routine immunization, adequate nutrition interventions, and services for infectious diseases. These are what we see as the sort of core elements of strong health systems. And in order to have a resilient health system, you need those building blocks to be there. So funding and sort of work on all of those areas, immunization, nutrition, and infectious disease are core. Essentially, a lot of the work that we would like to see the G7 do would happen through multilateral organizations, so like the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Malaria and TB and Gavi, and a lot of that is essentially through funding, so those governments committing to fund those multilateral organizations who then disperse that money across the globe to build up strength, health system strength elsewhere. But some of this work is also done sort of bilaterally through relationships that each of the G7 government holds with other countries, and through programmatic work as well. So yeah, I think the UK has to use the G7 as an opportunity to further strengthen the multilateral system. We've seen through the COVID response how important it is for countries to work together and for those key multilateral organisations to be well funded. So we hope that as a result of the impact those multilateral systems have had in the COVID response, we might see some reflection of that in funding commitments this year, not only to sort of recover from the pandemic, but also to build back on the progress that's been lost in other global health remits as we sort of move forward away from the pandemic. So I think linking onto that, leveraging the COVID response offers a really unique opportunity to improve the quality and efficiency of health services and to accelerate progress of global health beyond COVID-19, particularly sort of looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and all of the many commitments that are due to be met by 2030 on global health. And having strong health systems is critical to all of that happening. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Claire. Yet another very comprehensive answer. So 20 minutes left. We've got one more pre question. We want to make sure that everybody else gets a chance to ask questions too. But let's go to London for pre-canned question number 3.
Yeah, hi Claire. So the question is, what is the role of the G7 in the global recovery from COVID-19?
Thanks, Richard, and I'll try and be speedy with this one. So I think essentially COVID has highlighted health inequities around the world, and this means that for the first time, global health is the major topic on the G7 agenda. So previously it's been an element of the work they do, but I think this is the first time it's been sort of the core mandate of the G7. And more importantly, the finance and health streams of governments are working more closely together. So this year is a real opportunity for sort of change in the way that global health is framed. I think as well as the sort of direct impacts, we know that lower income communities have been disproportionately impacted in terms of deaths with COVID-19. But the secondary impacts are also critical and will continue to be for a long time as well, whether that's sort of employment prospects, national economies, education, and there have been really massive ramifications on global health. So on the areas that Results UK works on, COVID has had a massively detrimental impact on vaccination services, which have been halted, progress towards eradicating TB, and also disruption to food systems and education. So that essentially is why we need to see the G7 nations committing to spending and using language in the political declarations coming out of those ministerial meetings that commit to long-term work on supporting lower and middle income countries to recover from the direct and the indirect results of the pandemic. We're already seeing this in some immediate ways, so through funding to COVAX, the global vaccination scheme, and other sort of global response mechanisms. But what we need is a recognition of the indirect impacts and the long-term impacts of COVID-19. I think I mentioned earlier, but while obviously there are no end of negatives to the pandemic, there are also some positives, or not some positives, some opportunities. And the pandemic's highlighted what can be done when countries work well together. So we've seen massive investment in research and development and sort of global collaboration, which has resulted in a vaccination that occurred sort of in 1/10 of the time a vaccination would normally be developed, if that. So I think this year's G7 really is an opportunity to sort of leverage that collaboration that's happened throughout the pandemic through multilaterals and through the G7 nations. And as presidents, the UK should be at the forefront of committing to global pandemic recovery and building more resilient health systems, whilst also using our presidency to leverage commitments, both financial and policy-based, from the other nations in the G7 as well.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks for those answers. Great overview of the importance of the G7 at this particular moment in time. We've got 16 minutes left, which is great. We're going to open up the floor to anyone who'd like to ask a question on the topic. So please do make sure to introduce yourself before you ask Claire your question. We don't have any in the chat, so we will actually go straight to the line to see if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask something. So get your finger ready on that. Do type your question into the Zoom chat box if you just thought of something and you'd prefer to do that. And again, as before, you can, I mentioned you can text in a question. It's 0777 56 11178. Again, 0777 56 11178 if you've joined us from the phones. So as promised, fastest finger, does somebody want to unmute? And
hi,
Sammy, I see your hands up. Go for it.
So I just wondered if, as the UK is holding the conference this year, if and they get to pick what's sort of discussed, if that means that things like their aid cuts won't be mentioned as much, and so they won't be held accountable for that, as they get to pick more what's mentioned.
That's a really good question. So I think, yeah, there won't be anything formal on the agenda looking at sort of UK aid cuts. It's possible that other countries would bring it up sort of in discussion, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure to the extent that will happen, because it would be quite sort of combative, I think. But yeah, so there won't be anything formal on the agenda looking at aid cuts or anything similar to that. There'll potentially be mention of it, but I don't think that will play a major role. I think it is a difficult a difficult one, because obviously the UK would hope, as president, you would hope that they would be committing the most money, but it seems unlikely. So yeah, I think there'll be nothing formal about it, but it could come up sort of informally in discussions.
Thanks, Claire. Great question. We've had a question come in from Jamil in the chat, so I'm going to go to them to ask it.
Hi, Claire. So I read on the Global Governance Project that that 76% of the binding commitments made at the G7 are stuck to. So even if there are commitments on global health at the G7, what do results think that the best way is to ensure that those are adhered to, and kind of what's the longer term strategy as well as obviously before the G7 and then after?
Thanks, Jamil. Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and something we've been talking about internally quite a lot, around sort of accountability for the G7 and the G20 and those wider sort of global mechanisms. In practical terms, there isn't really any accountability for G7 commitments. So I think each year they publish an accountability report, but that is written by the G7 on their own accountability. So there's a limited extent to which that can really push for those commitments, I think. Otherwise, I mean, you're right that I think a lot of the G7 commitments are missed, and to some extent, because there's a G7 summit every year, it's quite easy for previous commitments to be forgotten when new ones are made each summer. I think the best mechanism for holding the G7 countries to account is through civil society organisations like Results UK. So through engagement, building sort of relationships with civil servants in the departments that sort of work on those commitments, so the FCDO and the Cabinet Office, and the Health Department in some contexts as well. And then there are sort of wider civil society working groups and things like that, which will discuss the commitments that have been made, look at progress, and kind of come up with, sort of establish what our priorities are in terms of pushing the government to meet those commitments. But yeah, it is a really tricky one, and I think there's no sort of formal mechanism for it, which does make accountability hard. So I think it's about leveraging those relationships that we hold with the people who work on those commitments within government to sort of push them to meet them. But yeah, it is a tricky one.
Thanks.
Never underestimate also the power of G7 leaders holding each other to account on that one. Now that America is back to the table and there are a few more grown-ups sitting around it, I think that we really shouldn't underestimate the power of being called out for making promises you're not keeping, or for your rhetoric being different from what you're actually doing with things like your aid budget. I think that this G7 is potentially a major moment of embarrassment for our government if they are held to account in the run up to and at the G7. And I think the kind of letters that we're hopefully all going to be writing tonight will, I think, make a meaningful contribution to building that momentum around being a grown up at the table. I'm going to read out Vikki's question in the interest of time. Vikki has asked a very smart question. Obviously, we have results, well, maybe not obviously for the new people, but we do have results organisations in some of the other G7 countries, US, Canada, Australia is coming as a visitor this time. Can you tell us a bit about how you're collaborating with them so that all the different countries are getting the same messages about what we want? Or are there personalized messages for different countries?
Another really good question. We work quite closely with the other results organisations and with our action partnership, which is made up of a number of different organisations globally. In sort of practical terms, we meet with them regularly. We all talk through our sort of key messaging and recommendations we're making to our individual country governments, and look at where we want to sort of draw parallels between the different governments and the sort of priorities we're putting to them. I think we are planning on doing a sort of joint document at some stage, just to set out the action partnerships priorities for the G7, and I think that's really important because that working group involves organisations from the Global South. So putting out a sort of external document that includes the input from across the globe is super important, I think, this year more than ever when we're looking at global pandemic recovery.
I'm going to jump the queue. Vikki's follow-up question, I think, is really relevant. Can we ask them to ask their ministers to hold our government to account?
That's a really excellent question. Yeah, I think so. I don't see why not. And I think that's a really good tool when we are so frustrated with our government. I think leveraging that relationship elsewhere would be a really powerful thing to do. Yeah.
Certainly, yes. And it's certainly something we do all the time with things like replenishment moments. The one-upsmanship of, excuse me, of different donor governments stepping up to the plate. Results Norwich, we're going to go to you for the next question. You popped it in the chat. Are you able to say it out loud?
Hi there, Claire. It's Mark here from Results Norwich. Just what I got to know was that would we be able to watch the debates for the G7, or are they behind closed doors and we just get like a press conference?
That's a really good question, which I don't know the answers to. I know I think there were sort of readouts from those meetings afterwards, and obviously the declarations are made public, but I don't know, Aaron, if you would know that. They're televised.
I think most of it happens behind closed doors. You've got to be a bit of an insider to get into the room on a lot of those. I'd be happy to be corrected, but I'm pretty sure it's private and we get the press conference.
Thank you.
Right, we've had a couple of really great questions come in the chat. I'm just taking a look. There's a lot going through. One is from Stephen. Stephen, I'll just read it out for you if that's okay. It says, the action this month is to ask the UK, quote, to influence G7 leaders to put their weight behind a global, equitable approach to building health systems to enable a more effective response and sustainable recovery from the pandemic and to achieve universal health coverage. What does putting their weight amount to in this context, and how will we know if we've succeeded?
Another fantastic question. I think in some ways their weight is financial. A lot of what we need to see is commitments to funding all of these critical sort of building blocks of resilient health systems, as well as using those communiques, particularly the leaders' communique that the presidents and prime ministers put out. That's a really critical document for setting the policy agenda. So I think if we see language on the areas we're campaigning on, so health system strengthening, or looking at that more in a more sort of granular way, infectious disease response, nutrition, child health and vaccinations. If we see language on that within those communiques and declarations, I think that would be a really powerful sort of win from us, definitely.
Thanks, Claire. Barreling through the rest of the questions, only 5 minutes left, and there's still some good ones. Amy, you've got a question. Do you want to ask it?
I do. I'm Amy from the London group. Thanks so much for all of your really comprehensive answers so far, Claire. They've been really interesting. So my question is, what challenges do you foresee in getting Results UK's priorities on the agenda of the G7 countries? Are you expecting any particular obstacles in constructive conversations with delegates or Sherpas there? Or are you even expecting to have to compete with other priorities from other industries and sectors, to get Results UK's priorities on the list?
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I mean, I think, as I sort of mentioned before, this year is a really good opportunity for global health. So I think more than ever, it's quite likely that we'll see a lot of the topics, particularly the more general sort of umbrella of health system strengthening. I think that it seems fairly likely. Whether we'll get specific language on the key areas that Results UK works on is a different question. Some of them are already priorities for the G7. So within tuberculosis, antimicrobial resistance is a major aspect of what we're working on, and that has been already stated as a commitment for the G7. So I think the risk is that the focus is on COVID and on nothing else. So while that is important for what we're talking about, we're also talking about a much wider global health issue or issues. So I would say that's the risk, that everything becomes about COVID and COVID response. And we don't look any further forward than that, or look to build back on the progress that's been lost elsewhere through the pandemic.
Thanks, Claire. And I think one thing to flag to everybody, of course, is that most normal people don't pay any attention to the G7, and they certainly don't take any kind of action to influence it. I would hazard a guess that the letters that our recipients get in the next few weeks from you all on the G7 will be the only letters they get from the UK public on the G7. And so they will be read, and they will probably have, as I mentioned right at the start of the call, quite an outsized impact for the number, for the amount of time and energy that you put into writing them. So please do that. That's you have a chance to really punch above your weight, as we often say in Results, about what it is that we do. Carrie, you said something in the chat about how to go about doing this. And do you want to just repeat that just for?
When we're writing up to these big wigs, the Dominic Raabs and the Michael Goves, I find I copy my MP into what I've written to a minister, and MPs like to, it spreads the information, and it also, you can get inquiries sideways from your MP as well. And sometimes, I mean, my old MP used to write a letter as well, although it wasn't addressed to her. It piqued her interest, and it gave them an in for MPs to write to ministers as well, so, or ask questions. So it can have, you can drop a seed onto fertile ground in that respect.
And yes, Ricky and Macclesfield saying that they like that technique as well. I mean, I think, how successful that will be, of course, depends a lot on who your MP is and what kind of relationship you've built with them, how well briefed they are on the issues and all the rest of it. But, it's always good to spread the love around, so to speak, and keep even more decision makers informed about what matters to you, their constituent. So, yeah, we are at time. I am so sorry, but we did manage to get through all the questions in the chat, which is the first. That's great. I just want to say a massive thank you to Claire for sharing her expertise on the G7 with us this evening. Thanks, Claire. And oh, great, claps, wonderful. We are going to ask you to please do take this month's action. It is, as you've hopefully figured out by now, it's to write to the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, MP, to express support for a strong commitment from the G7 to strengthening health systems around the world, acting in solidarity with other nations to ensure that no one is left out of the global COVID response, and that the additional challenges from the pandemic on global health, such as nutrition and other infectious diseases, are not forgotten. Now, the G7 is on the 11th to 13th of June, so that gives you an idea when we'd like you to write your letters by. Bear in mind that as the summit approaches, more and more of the stuff inside it and its outcomes will have already been pre-agreed behind the scenes. So even though it is a decent distance away, it's still important to write your letters sooner rather than later, get in early. So yeah, I hope you can really take action on that, and we look forward to hearing from you as you do. Now, our next Grassroots Conference Call, mark your diaries, it's at the regular time on the regular channel. It's going to be the first Tuesday of the month. That's the Tuesday, the 4th of May, at the usual time of 8 p.m, same time this one started. So finally, I'd like to thank you all once again for all of your efforts to address global poverty, particularly during these exceptionally challenging times. I want you to make sure that you take some time to look after yourself too, because that's really, really important. Good night from me, everyone. Wishing you all the best to enjoy the rest of your evenings and this beautiful spring weather. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye.